So Bethany asked me to answer the question, why does God, a good God, allow suffering in the world? So I wrote down a few things that I thought answered this question because I do think it's a really interesting, really good question. So Romans 8:28 tells us that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. It is hard to believe these lines when we witness baffling and horrific events. So the primary Old Testament illustration of this is Genesis 50:20, when Joseph's brother betray him and sell him into slavery. Everyone knows that story. But decades later, he tells them, what you intended for harm, God intended for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So that is kind of the illustration that a lot of people use when they think of like what you intended for evil, God intended for good. But what I really wanted to talk about was like the good of the cross, the suffering of the cross versus the good of the cross. So the cross is God's answer to the question, why don't you do something about evil? So God did do something, and what he did was so powerful that it ripped in half from the top down the fabric of the universe itself. So God does not merely empathize with our sufferings, he literally inserted himself into history through Jesus. What Jesus suffered, God suffered. God ordained and allowed Jesus temporary suffering so he could prevent eternal suffering. So, in the same way that Good Friday isn't called Bad Friday, because we see it in retrospect. We know that out of the appalling bad came inexpressible good, and the good ultimately trumps the bad. Although the bad was temporary, the good was eternal. If someone had delivered Jesus from his suffering, Jesus couldn't have delivered us from our suffering. So Paul wrote, for it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him. He wrote that in Philippians 1:29. He said, in fact, everyone who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted, in 2 Timothy. Jesus noted, in this world you will have trouble. Abel, who pleased God, was murdered by Cain. Noah, Abraham, Joseph, and Moses, nearly all the prophets, and many other biblical figures suffered. As followers of Christ, believers routinely suffer, but God has a way of using it for his own purposes. Every character in God's story serves a purpose, as do the characters of his story today, believers in Jesus. So, Joseph, after being sold into slavery and later sent to prison on false accusations, surely had endured enough for one life, and at times he must have felt like giving up. Talk to Job in the middle of his story. After 10 of his children were dead, his body was covered in excruciating boils, and feeling as if God had completely abandoned him. And his friends were also haggling him. And Job even says, why did I not perish at birth? But Job also says that God knows the way I take when he has tested me. I will come forth as gold, in Job 23:10. And later, Job remarks, my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have truly seen you. So, the last thing I wanted to talk about is working together for good. If each of us were to list both the best and the worst things that have ever happened to us, we are bound to see an overlap in these two lists, especially if we have lived for a long time. God has used some of the worst things to accomplish some of the best things, like the lists already shown. Romans 8:28 is true. And someday, we will see how it was true all along, each time suffering came along.